It is good to be back here in the Ohio Valley. I really appreciate the invitation, and I've been looking forward to this for some time. This is home, and it's always good to be back home and to see people. I can't start naming names. I've seen several people so far that I've known all my life, and it's good to have them here. And I hope, again, you'll have your Bible with you. And let's engage in a period of study together that hopefully will cause us to think about how we view people. The lesson's titled, Through the Eyes of Jesus. I wish I could see the world through the eyes of Jesus. Sometimes I see the world through my eyes and it's a bit cynical. I don't see the value necessarily of every person. And I see that in Jesus. He didn't come to save the elect. He didn't come to save the good, the righteous. He came to save the world. And that includes the worst of sinners. And I need to see people through the eyes of Jesus. Now, my wife and I, we don't see even the same way. We went to a movie one time, and you know how they'll scroll the credits at the end of a movie? This place, they scrolled the credits on this particular movie at the beginning. And as we were watching the credits, it was showing some scenes in the background. You had to see it through the credits as they scrolled. And Kim was already grabbing tissue. She was crying, emotional, and I'm thinking, what in the world? How can you be, it's the credits. And she's already emotional. And so she sees things differently than I do. And if you understand that, I think you can understand what I'm trying to talk about. We need to see through the eyes of Jesus and see this world and see people as Jesus does. And so to illustrate what I'm talking about, let's open our Bibles to Luke chapter 7. I like the book of Luke. The gospel accounts, as you know, there are 4 of them. And each one focuses on a different aspect. Matthew was written to prove that Jesus was the King of the Jews, that he was coming to set up a kingdom, the long-awaited Messiah. Mark showed his power and his action, and it was written probably to the Romans. And you get to Luke, and Luke presents Jesus as the Son of Man, and John presents him as the Son of God. And as the Son of Man, what the expression son of means equality with, same nature as. You remember sometimes the Bible might say, James and John were called the sons of thunder. That didn't mean thunder was their daddy. That meant that they had the character, the nature of thunder. And there are sons of perdition, and there are sons of God. That means they have the nature of. Well, when Luke calls Jesus the Son of Man, he was demonstrating to us that Jesus was human. He took on flesh, as John said, and dwelt among us, and we beheld the glory of God when we looked at him. And so, as you go through the book of Luke, you'll often see compassion and the stories of Jesus dealing with those who are maybe more outcast. There are more stories about women who were not viewed highly by that culture at that time, and how that Jesus lifted them up. The poor, the broken, those are the people that Luke talks about more often than not. So, in Luke chapter 7 and verse 36, beginning, I'd like for you to read this passage. This is about a man who had a dinner, had Jesus over for dinner, and it was interrupted. And it was interrupted by a sinful woman. So let's begin, verse 36. Then one of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went down to the Pharisee's house and sat down to eat. Now, a Pharisee was a strict observer of the law. The word Pharisee means separated. They pulled off from the rest of the Jewish culture and society because they were special students of the law. And they dedicated themselves to following every little rule that they could come up with. And they made a lot of their own. But this man, who was very religious, has invited Jesus to his house. This was a big deal. We don't have company like we used to. You know, when I was a kid, every Sunday there were people that would come over to the house, or we would go out to other people's houses and we would get together, and there was all that interaction in houses. We're pretty standoffish today. We don't have that same kind of interaction like we once did. But here's a man who has Jesus to his house, and I'm sure that's a big deal to him. Jesus is this rabbi, this teacher who has come, and he's come with signs and wonders. And people are going, who is this? He's mobbed everywhere he goes. And this Pharisee has somehow had enough clout, probably as he thought, to have Jesus come for a personal dinner at his house. Think of how important that must have been. What would it be to you to have the president? You pick the president of your choice. I don't want to get into politics. Your favorite president. What if you could have him, come to your house for dinner? Man, you would be sweeping the floors, and you'd be dusting the house, and you'd be making sure everything was just right. I know what it's like to have the preacher over. You know, we lived, just across the river there, and our house, we had an upstairs bedroom, and that was called the preacher's bedroom. That's where all the visiting preachers stayed. They stayed in the upstairs of our house. Even in the basement of our house, the basement was used for programs, stepping stones, visitation groups, all that. And so we had to keep our house cleaned all the time because there were all kind of activities. And we would have preachers over. And my mom, when we would have we're having a gospel meeting, Johnny Ramsey's coming over, she'd pull the refrigerator out and clean behind the refrigerator. I was always stunned by that. And I said, Mom, he's not going to pull the refrigerator out and look behind there to see if you clean properly. But it didn't matter. Everything had to be meticulous because the preacher was coming over. This Pharisee's having Jesus to his house. And I'm sure he has this dinner planned just right. It was really important. Well, let's see how it plays out. And behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner. When she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil and stood at his feet behind him, weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. She kissed his feet and anointed them with fragrant oil. So much for this dignified meal. This uninvited woman just barges in the house. She's not a part of the guest. She just barges in the house because she heard that Jesus was in that house. And she breaks in. Don't just miss the awkwardness of that. We can read these stories, and we can read right past that. You put yourself in the story. Would you break into somebody's house? Just when you leave here today, would you just go stop at somebody's house and walk in and fall down at their feet and start crying and all that kind of commotion? Of course not. And if you did, the people in that house be 911. Call the police. Somebody needs to take this person away. She has thrown caution to the wind and etiquette and protocol to the wind and come and thrown herself at the feet of Jesus. And as she lays there, she's behind him and she's crying and she's kissing his feet and the tears are falling on her feet and she's taking her hair and wiping his feet. And then she has this flask of fragrant oil. Now, she breaks that open and pours it on the feet of Jesus, anoints his feet with it. Don't look at anybody when I say this, but have you ever come to church and somebody has really put a lot of perfume on? Like a lot. And it almost chokes you. And they can walk down the aisle and you can be on the other end and you can smell it as they walk down the aisle. And it's just like, whoa. It may smell fine, but that's a lot. Well, this woman comes and just breaks open this flask and smells up the whole place. Now, it may have smelled good, but it would have been a lot. So, from this Pharisee's perspective, here's this woman comes in. I'm trying to have this dignified person here, and I'm trying to have everything just right. And notice, this sinful woman comes in, falls at his feet, makes this scene, stinks up the place. I don't think he's too happy. And look at what it says next. Now when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what manner of woman this is who's touching him, for she's a sinner. So he's sitting there watching, standing there watching what's taking place, and he's going, wait a second. I thought this man was a prophet. But here he is letting this woman touch him. And she's a sinful woman. Twice now in the text, it says she was a sinful woman. That's how she is seen. And he's kind of put off by that. He says, well, maybe he isn't all that. Maybe he isn't that prophet, that great man. Because if he were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman she was, and he wouldn't be letting her touch him. So he has that all going on in his mind as this is playing out in his house. And then Jesus, verse 40, then Jesus answered and said to him. Now I think that's really important. Jesus answered. Answered what? He hadn't said anything out loud. It says that he was thinking this in his mind. And Jesus answered what he was thinking. Because he was God. He was able to know. I do a terrible job. Every time I try to judge a person and say, I know why they did that, I'm wrong. I'm the worst judger. And I guess that's why Jesus said, don't do that. We can't judge one another's motives. And here's this man thinking bad of Jesus because this woman was doing this. And Jesus answers, he knows exactly what he's thinking. He's answering his thoughts. And here's what he says. Simon, I have something to say to you. That was the Pharisee's name, Simon. So he said, teacher, say it. And he said, well, there was a certain creditor who had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii, the other 50. And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which one will love him more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one who forgave him more. And he said, you have rightly judged. Now, the story. We don't know what a denarii is. That's currency from a different time in a different place. So let's just put it in dollars. Let's say you owe somebody $50 and somebody else owed them $500. And they say, hey, do you have my money? No, I don't. Both of them say, no, I don't have it. Don't worry about it. You're good. You don't ever have to pay me back. Which one would be happier about that? Well, obviously the one who was forgiven the most. The guy who had owed $500. He's been forgiven. That debt is off his shoulders. And so Jesus makes that point and says, you have judged rightly. He turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You didn't anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little was forgiven, the same loves little. This Pharisee, who had it all together, who was a very religious man, he's the $50 guy. And this woman is the $500 guy. She's been forgiven much, so she loved much. When we think that we don't need God's grace and forgiveness, we fail to love God to the extent we should. We need to understand how deeply in debt we are, even the best of us. And that'll cause us to have greater love for the Lord. But I want you to see this one statement that Jesus made. Then he turned to the woman, verse 44, and he said to Simon, you remember the woman is behind him? He turned to the woman, he turns his back, but he's talking to Simon. And he says, Simon, do you see this woman? What kind of a question is that? Do you see this woman? Of course he sees this woman. This woman has broken into his house uninvited, has fallen down and made a scene at the table, and has stunk the place up with her perfume, and is crying and this chaos. And you're asking me, do you see this woman? There's a point to that question. Because as you'll see, Simon didn't really see this woman. Not as Jesus saw her. You see, what Simon saw is this woman who, uninvited, breaks into his home, makes a scene. He sees, and it's mentioned twice, he sees a sinner, a sinful woman. You know, one of those women that hang down there on the corner. That's the kind of woman she is. That he knows that very well. She's a sinful woman. That's all he can see. But I'm telling you, Jesus saw something different. He and Simon did not see the same thing. And the best way I know to describe that is I've always used this illustration. My grandma King, well, you know, Gary Amos is here. I'm going to call his name out. Gary lives right across the street from where Mom and Dad lived, you know, in Chester. And Gary and I graduated from high school together. We went to school together. And Gary's grandparents lived in Reeder, West Virginia as well. And that's where my grandma and granddad lived. We met up one time when we were kids on the railroad tracks. But anyway, Gary, my grandma King eventually developed dementia. And she didn't know anything. And she came to live with us. And she would sit. I would go, you know, I was off to college at that time, and I didn't understand fully how difficult that was, because I came home for break and she would just, you know, say things like, I can too count to 100. Yes, I can. No, you can't. Yes, I can. Let me show you. And then she'd start counting to 100. When she'd get done, she'd say, see, I told you I could count to 100. You say I can't count to 100? I can count to 100. And then she'd do it again. And it would just be nonstop all day long. And it was just, you know, it was taxing. But I came home one summer, and I imagined this scenario. If one of my friends would have come over to the house, and I said, and she sat in a certain chair in the living room, and if I said, see the woman over there in that chair, what do you see? My friends would say, I see an old lady who doesn't have her mind and is just waiting to die. And they would be right to an extent, but they're missing a lot. Because I could look at her and I could see so much more. I could see her as a little girl skipping down a dirt road, going to a one-room schoolhouse when she's little. I could see in my eyes a woman who falls in love with my granddad and has children, and I can see her holding my mom and the joy she would have had holding my mom. And I can see a little glass cookie jar that has a green lid about that big. Whenever we would go to Reeder, that's the first thing. As soon as I got to the house, I'd go straight to the kitchen for that cookie jar because there were always homemade sugar cookies in that jar. It was too big to open. You'd have to take two hands because I was little and have to do like that to open that and get those cookies. And then we would go in the basement. It was always wintertime usually because it was, we'd go for Christmas break and we would go visit my grandparents. And my sister and I would sleep in the basement and it was cold. They had a gas heater down there, just a single gas heater. And so because it was cold, my grandma had made 1,000 quilts, in her day. And she would just pile quilt after quilt on my sister and on me and our respective beds. And we were never cold. We couldn't roll over, we were stuck, because of the weight of the quilts. But we were warm. And you see, I could see all of that. But they couldn't. They just saw a dying woman. And that's what's going on here. Simon could only see a sinful woman, this sinner in town. He couldn't get past that. But Jesus sees so much more. He sees a woman who is desperate to better herself. When she heard that Jesus was in this man's house, she knows how awkward it is to just go to some strange house and break in. You don't do that. What would it take for you on the way home to just stop at somebody's house and run in and fall down on the floor and start crying? But what would I have to give you to do that? I don't know that I could give you enough to make you do that. That should demonstrate to you how desperate this woman was. She breaks all rules of etiquette and protocol and throws herself at the feet of Jesus. And Jesus knows this woman is desperate to get out of sin. This woman probably is tired of the looks that she got from other people in town. The other women in town, the respectable women, would have probably seen her as a threat, a risk. Is she enticing my husband? The men in town who might visit her at night have nothing to say to her during the day. She has no self-respect. She wouldn't have been invited to walk to the well with the respectable women in the cool of the morning to get the water for the day. She probably had to walk by herself or with other sinful women in the heat of the day to get her water. She's tired of it all. She's tired of feeling the way she feels. And so when she hears that Jesus is in the house, she does what no one would normally do. She just barges in and throws herself at the feet of Jesus. Jesus didn't miss that. Simon did. All he saw was a sinful woman. Jesus saw a sinful woman desperate to do better. And he forgave her. Her sins were many, and she has been forgiven. He says in verse 48, then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And then that caused people who were at the table saying, who does this guy think he is? Forgiving sins. But here's the challenge of the lesson. I want us to see like Jesus sees. It's easy, it's low-hanging fruit to just size a person up. There are people who are obviously this or that, and we can just put them in their little, hole, and we understand who they are, we size them up, and we dismiss them. But Jesus calls us to see beyond the obvious. And I'm calling you to do that. As people of God, we need to see beyond the obvious. There are people who are hard to be with, socially awkward. Have you ever said, Kim has corrected me on this a time or two. I'll go like this, for telephone. She said, that's not the way you do it anymore. It's this. Nobody has a phone like that anymore, right? But I'm old school, and I just, it's that. But anyway, Have you ever gotten a phone call and you say, oh, don't answer that. Don't answer that. I'll be 20, 30 minutes if I answer that. I just can't deal with it. Or you're standing in the aisle and here comes somebody walking down and says, oh, don't look, don't make eye contact. And then they walk on by and you're like, whew, I was afraid they were going to stop and talk to me. And there are people who are on the outside. And truthfully, sometimes we want to keep them there. And that's not what Jesus would do. He would pull them in. And I know that when you get involved with messy people and people with messy lives, it gets messy. It gets hard. You'll have to give up some of your own personal rights. You may be inconvenienced. It may cost you money. It may take more patience than you expected to have to give. But it's what Jesus would do. And that's what I'm asking us, to see through the eyes of Jesus. Maybe the people that you've been running from are the people you need to reach out to. Maybe the people, I've heard of churches that are targeting young, urban professionals. That's the kind of people we want. We want young, rich people, well-dressed children. That's the kind of people we want at our church. That is so unlike Jesus. He's not targeting certain kinds of people. Jesus came for sinners. And when we forget that, we've forgotten the mission of Christ. If we just want a little church of put together people that are rich and all that kind of thing and educated, then we're missing the mission of Jesus. We're not seeing people through his eyes. Jesus calls us to see those who are messy. We had a guy that was in prison. He was just released and he came to the congregation where I was preaching. And he eventually obeyed the gospel while he was there with us. And he told me privately, he said, you want to know one of the major factors that I gave my life to Jesus? It's because you didn't treat me as an ex-con. You treated me as a real person. Even women in this congregation would come and speak to me. Even, knowing who I was, there were people who they spoke to me. I had been to countless churches before I came here, and they treated me at arm's length. They wouldn't let me get close to them. And he said, that was not attractive to me. That pushed me away. But because I came here, and we saw them through the eyes of Jesus, the congregation did. He was welcomed and accepted, and he obeyed the gospel, and now he's on his way to heaven. Because people had the right vision. And that's what my challenge is to you today. And I wanted you to look at this example because I think it's a perfect example. Jesus knows Simon is not seeing her like he should. And so he asks the question, do you see this woman? Well, yes, he saw her, but he didn't see her. And could that be said of us? Are there people that we see but we don't really see? And if that's the case, we need to make changes. There are people who have messy lives, and they, more than anybody else, need Jesus. And if you'll take the time to see them, then maybe that's where our evangelistic efforts can see rich fruit. People who have it all together and don't need anything, they don't need the Lord either. They got their bucket full. But people who are struggling, those are the people who are more receptive to the message of Christ because they know he can meet their needs. And so let's try to look at people differently and reach out to them with the gospel of Christ. If you're here this morning and you're not yet a child of God, I want to encourage you to obey the gospel. Jesus said, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. I absolutely believe that. That's what Jesus said. And so I take him at his word. If you haven't done that, I encourage you to do that. And if you have done that, but you have wandered from living for Him, then confess your fault, and God will be faithful and just to forgive you. We'll pray with you if you need the prayers of the brethren here. And so we invite you to come as we sing this song. If you need to be baptized or if you need us to pray for you, we invite you to come as we sing.